Hey guys, welcome back, and thank you again for tuning in to the second episode of BITSA podcast. My name is David, who are one of the hosts. Today with me, co-hosting again is Rachel. Hey Rachel, thanks again for joining in.
Hey
Good to see you
David,
again.
great to be back on the podcast.
Sweet. So for today's episode, we have a lovely guest joining us, Blair Wang, who is a former co-op BIS student, and is currently also a lecturer and a PhD student at the UNSW Business School. Do you want to give a little introduction about yourself, Blair?
Hello, everyone. Well, thank you for having me here today in your on your radio waves, as it were. Thanks, David and Rachel, for that introduction. I think you've pretty much covered it. I used to be among you as a student, and now I found myself as a lecturer. And I'm also a student because I am a PhD candidate here at the School of Information Systems at UNSW.
Thanks, Blair. It is great to have you on to speak on the podcast. So just a little brief agenda of what we're going to be talking about today. We'll just be running a little bit through about Blair's undergraduate journey, his journey through industry as a co-op student, but also as a graduate. And he'll be providing students advice on, firstly, studying and balancing multiple commitments, as he had to battle a lot of those when he was a student back in the day. Secondly, is to help students figure out what kind of career path to follow, especially in the tech career, and how what advice that he provides when he was choosing his career path. And thirdly, is to address the theory that INFS students can pursue technical roles, since Blair himself had a pretty technical career trajectory. It'll be interesting to see what kind of advice he can provide to students in taking a technical path, especially those that are studying INFS. And lastly, we'll be touching a little bit on the courses that he'll be teaching, but also he's got a nice, exciting announcements to make about a new INFS course that will be introduced in T3 this year. So that's an interesting announcement to listen on to. So stay tuned. And I guess we've got a lot of things lined up today, so let's get on to it, I guess. Sweet. So Blair, you've had a large or different type of experience as an undergraduate student here, with all different placements you've done, and now you're pursuing a PhD. If you can start with the university side, could you provide me more detail around your degree and what made you choose to study info straight out of high school?
Yeah, sure. So the first part in relation to the degree I chose to study is one that many of you probably study. It's a Bachelor of Information Systems. Of course, there are different variations of this. I know many of you, for example, would do a combined degree. I did the co-op degree, which I think is still being offered, where there are 3 built-in placements. So I chose to do that out of high school for a number of different reasons. I actually didn't think I'd end up doing an IT degree. I was surrounded by friends who would study things like medicine or law, and I just never really felt the same connection to those things as I did with certain other areas of study. Tech was one of them, but I always, going into things like open days for software engineering, surprisingly, for some of you might be surprised to hear that as a student in high school, I thought that I could never do any coding. So I thought I wanted to do something with technology that doesn't involve coding. And at the same time, I had a really strong interest in economics. And I remember going to my high school careers advisor, and he was kind of saying, this is a very strange situation you find yourself in. And as I was walking out of his office, he had like a little, you know how they have those printed pamphlets for like UNSW, the yellow. So he had that there, and I'm like, business information systems. That sounds kind of similar. And I remember coming to the open day here at UNSW and thinking, this is a pretty good fit. Like, it's a bit different to anything I'd ever heard of. And of course, the fact that it did have this practical component that was really attractive, and as I'm sure it would be for a lot of you, to have any kind of opportunity to connect with industry. So that's how I ended up in that undergraduate degree.
So you talked a little bit about your co-op scholarship, and you mentioned that you did the 3 placements. So could you give us a little bit of an insight into, where did you do your placements? What role did you take on in those placements, and how would you describe each of those placements? What were they like?
Certainly. So I guess many of the listeners to this podcast would be from different backgrounds. Some of them may have done cadetships, internships. Others might have never touched those things. So as a student going into an organization, there's two sort of philosophies of this. One is that they just want to give you like a tasting menu of everything that company is about. And the other is that they'll give you a very clearly defined role. So I had both experiences with my placements. The first one was at Origin Energy. So they, as many of you are aware, maybe some of you are customers, they provide electricity and gas services. So that was really interesting because it was my first placement and they were quite aware of it, and they knew that I'd never worked in that kind of corporate environment. So they just really let me see different parts of the business, try to help out where possible. I learned a lot about how electricity works in Australia, and that wasn't really what I was expecting to learn, but it's kind of cool, and it definitely matches with a lot of the interests that I had. Many of you would probably not really consider that to be IT, but I really enjoyed that, and certainly there's a computing aspect to it. I mean, there's computers that manage the national electricity grid, for example. My second placement was with American Express, and that was very different. That was much more in the direction of a very focused role because I was in a very specific team. I was in the Asia Pacific merchant services tech team, and so this is a very specific role because you have lots of technical organizations who would do all the technical work, and you have other organizations that deal with the financial stuff that American Express would necessarily have to do. So this is a very niche and specialist team, and so everyone there has a very clearly defined purpose. I was trying to do a lot of the help with a lot of the business analysis, project management stuff that goes into a thing like that. I learned a lot about the servers that, for those of you who have taken INFS 3617, a lot of the server configurations and things like that, about like how money flows between countries and what happens when you swipe your plastic card at a POS terminal. Also very different. I then, for my third and final placement, was at IBM. And so for that one, I wasn't aware of the difference between in-house versus client-facing at the time. But so for those of the audience who maybe aren't so clear about that, the first two companies that I mentioned, they have their own IT team. And so the IT team serves the company that you're working for. But IBM is a technology company. So it has clients, which it then sells technology services to. So even though I was working for IBM as an intern, what I was really doing is I was sitting in the head office of David Jones in the city as part of the project to rebuild the David Jones website. Now that was more than 5 years ago, and the website has since, of course, changed. But at the time, it was really exciting. It's just a very different kind of experience. So I think it's very hard to say what everyone's experience would be going to things like that. I know that co-op scholars and cadets and interns always have a very different experience to each other, but that was my own personal story.
Yeah, that sounds entirely fantastic. What a great diversity in those experiences. I think the Origin Energy definitely speaks to me as being something that's a learning that's outside of your degree that is definitely very relevant to today with what's happening with the energy markets. So you had a great opportunity to do a bunch of industry experience during your degree. How important do you feel that internships are for students, and how do they supplement your study?
Right, yeah. So I think I might, to set up my explanation for this, in Japanese management philosophy, Toyota, maybe some of you have studied things like Six Sigma and Lean, which is coming out of the Japanese management philosophy. They have this concept, and I do apologize for any listeners who speak Japanese, I don't, but Genchi Genbutsu, which roughly translates as go and see things as they are. So this is a whole discussion from like management theory, but there was this whole thing about how Western factory management systems would basically, the top level managers would just get reports and data from the bottom, and then they try to make decisions. Whereas in the alternative Japanese philosophy, they would go and the managers would go to the front line and see what was happening there. That was the whole thing about Genchi Genbutsu. So I say that because I think for me that really is also, funnily enough, an explanation for the benefit of doing any kind of organizational experience. Internships in big companies, I think, are a great one because they have such a unique culture. Each of the three that I went to had a very different culture to each other, and of course also different to what we see in the university. But I think you would get a very similar thing, not necessarily just having to go to a company, but any kind of organization, volunteering societies, sometimes within UNSW can have a very different culture to the rest of UNSW. And so, for example, I did those three internships, but one of the things that I did when I was a student was that I volunteered at a bunch of different places, and so that also, like, obviously I wasn't paid for those things, but to just go there and try to help out and see what that organization is like. These are the things that it's really hard for anyone to teach anyone else by conveying the information. It's the kind of unspoken stuff that you really just do have to, as the Japanese management philosophy goes, go and see for yourself.
No, that's definitely an amazing description of why it's important to do internships. I think I can kind of relate to you in terms of your experiences, because I did my placement at Origin as well, and I didn't know how complicated the energy industry and energy market was until I actually worked there and seeing how many support systems there are and things like that. That's definitely a great point to realize and point out. So apart from just doing your placement and just studying, we also know that you're a BITSA alumni. Hooray, hooray. So how's BITSA for you back then when you were a student? Also, what are your thoughts on doing extracurriculars and societies? How did that make an impact for you during your experience as a student?
That's wonderful. And yeah, so for context, I was in uni. My undergraduate degree was from 2012 to 2015. And so I came back to UNSW as a PhD candidate 2018, which, I mean, 3 years isn't that long, but it also kind of is. I remember coming back and seeing BITSA, and like, you guys had subcommittees. Like, the term subcommittee when I was when I was in BITSA, and so I was in the exec in 2013. I don't know. I don't think this would be the case now. We could fit the entire exec at a dinner table. Like, like we often did. We would have our meetings going to like a restaurant, and I think there were just like a dozen of us. But of course, the scope was much narrower. In fact, what I was really proud of that year, I was, I guess, the equivalent of the IT director, but we had a wonderful president, Jenny Yang. And so that was the first year where BITSA actually expanded beyond just attending to the needs of the co-op students. In the past, that was much more of its focus, that it was a support group. For any listeners who are co-op students, you could probably relate to it's a very uniquely challenging experience, the pressures of the mark requirements and so on. So that was a part of the original aim. But Jenny, the president back then, saw that there was a need to really expand and be more inclusive. And I mean, that seed was planted many years ago. We didn't see its fruits, but I can see with you folks what you're doing now. I don't know how you actually find the time to do all of it, but it's fantastic. I think just the other day I was scrolling through Facebook and there was like an INFS 2603 study notes writing thing, and it was organized by BITSA, and I was, gosh, you guys are pretty good. And I think it's wonderful that you folks have this avenue to. It's very similar to having those internships, this organizational experience, the occasional friction you have with team members, which is all part of the learning experience. So I did have BITSA, and to me that was really helpful. It also just was a great way to connect with older mentors, as well as to be able to connect with younger students, sort of going through the same degree. But I wasn't exclusively in BITSA because I did want to see some other things as well. As you probably have guessed, I became more technically interested throughout my undergraduate degree. So one of the other ones I found myself involved in fourth year was, I don't know if they're around anymore. I think they're no longer actually a society, but a company. But they were called e-reuse. So like the MCIC, the new engineering building next to the business school, that was built around 2015. And so because it was so new, they were trying to set up new stuff to do there. And so this was an organization that sort of was incubated in the MCIC, the Michael Crouch Innovation Center on the ground floor. And basically, like, all the different departments from UNSW, different faculties, have old computers that are no longer fast enough to do what they need to do, but they still work. I mean, they still do computer things. And you can imagine like a charity or a pro bono organization, a pro-social organization, they don't need the fastest computing. And if they can be given a $20 computer, an ex-university computer, they'd love to have it. So e-reuse, what we did was I think every Wednesday, every once a week, we'd go there at like 6 p.m., get a truckload, okay, not a truckload, a wheelbarrow load of old computers, and we'd like go into the hard drives, erase them, install Linux, make sure that there was no UNSW private data there, and then it would get shipped off to goodness knows which organizations. So that's very different to everything that BITSA does. But it was just a very uniquely important experience for my own development. Now, I mean, for many people, that'd be an awful experience, and they would hate to do something so technical, and they would much enjoy something like ISEC or like those consulting societies. So I think for each person, the society is just an expression of your own career pivoting as you're going through your 3, 4, 5 years of university.
Sweet. It's so interesting how you said BITSA is only just an exec team of just 6 people, because now our internal team is like a 74, 73 or something like that. So you can just kind of see in the last couple of years how big it's grown and how much information systems have grown within the last 5 years. So it's amazing to see that, and also just see about your experiences, because I know you also designed our initial logo as well, which is something that has been a massive trademark for us the last couple of years as well. So it's amazing how just that little, in that short 6 years, how much has changed. So you've talked about your experience as a student, your co-op placement, and then also societies, and also the organization that you joined. How do you, I guess my question is, what are some tips for students to balance commitments? Because obviously there'll be students that have similar commitments, or will be doing multiple things at the same time. So what are your tips on time management and balancing all these commitments at once while studying?
Before I answer that question, I do want to say the new logo is pretty nice. I do like semicolons. That was really cute. Y'all do SQL and Java. The semicolon's a bit of a funny one. I like that. So this next topic about time management is a big interest of mine, because it's actually closely related with my PhD research. And it's broadly this issue of knowledge work. So the big story is that, human beings, once upon a time, our work was to tend to the crops or hunt animals or manufacture widgets on the assembly line in the factory. And so with that kind of work, the amount of work you're doing is very visible. If you haven't done the crops will not grow and you will not have food. If you haven't made the widgets on the assembly line, it'll be very visible. But you and I, and the work that we're training for, and the work that a lot of our friends are training for, is what's called knowledge work. You may have heard of that before, where the product is not visible if you haven't done your work, or if you have, it's very difficult to see either way. And the theory is that that's what makes it so difficult. That's why mental illness is a bit bigger issue now, because if you're working on a farm, you're probably going to get physical illness. You're going to like injure yourself. Whereas if you're working in knowledge work, mental illness is because you're using your brain. And so a lot of the techniques around this kind of thing, I think some students have read this before, but if you haven't, there's 2 books I'd love to recommend. They're not long. The first one is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. It's really old, but it's really good. And the other one, which is a bit more modern, is Getting Things Done by David Allen. And so these 2 are really attacking this issue of knowledge work and going into the 21st century. I mean, I don't want to make this a whole podcast about that, but they talk about things like how you prioritize your time, how to like just make work visible. I mean, a lot of the stuff you see with like Agile, like the Scrum, not Scrum board, the Kanban board, it is this idea of like information being visible, and like they call it an information radiator because it's just there, it's imposing on you. So yeah, there's a lot more detail there. And I think that would be already, like if you as a student had those 2 books knowledge in your mind, you'd be way ahead of many of your peers, to be honest.
Fantastic advice. I mean, I think students often have a lot on their plate, so I would recommend to all students to go and read those books. I think I actually wrote it down so I can go read it myself. So next up, I'd like to talk a little bit and move ahead in time a bit. So after graduation, you had the opportunity to work in a couple more places in the industry. So could you tell us a little bit just about your industry journey after graduation?
Sure. So because I had interned at IBM as my final, I think, co-op placement. The terminology has changed a few times throughout my life. But yeah, so I had finished at IBM with this limited term placement, and I had really good relationships with the people there. So when it came to final year sending in the applications, it was just very frictionless to go in there. I even remember as part of the what's it called, the interview day, where you don't just have interviews but activities and stuff. It was I couldn't help but laugh because a lot of the people who were either interviewing me or testing me were people that I'd worked with, and it was just like, haha, you again, okay. So it was kind of a very natural transition. Now that's not the case for everyone, but I think I did have a pretty good time with my final placement. So uh, I ended up doing very different work in my actual graduate position. It was really, really uplifting and educating in a way to see what they were doing, because that was sort of 2016 when they were doing a lot of the analytics stuff. And later, if we're talking about INFS 2822, I think you could kind of see how the dots connect there as well. So that was a great opportunity. I got involved in a lot of different things. Because it was client facing, there's a lot of things I can't say. But broadly, I went in thinking I'd be doing more web development or something. I ended up doing systems management for analytics systems, and cybersecurity, which is also just completely unexpected. When I was in undergraduate, our equivalent of INFS 3617 had zero cybersecurity. So that was just up into the deep end you go. Good luck. Enjoy the firewall things. That was really interesting. And I think I probably learned 3 years worth of stuff in less than a year at IBM. I was approached on LinkedIn by an Israeli marketing startup, which had, of course, a branch in Sydney, in Macquarie Park. And they were looking for someone to do a bit more of the sort of web analytics stuff. And it was kind of like a natural next step to just try and see something else. That was really exciting. Startup has a certain reputation among students. And so that was really interesting. They are now part of Salesforce, but that happened after I left, because I actually then, second year out, after spending some time at Datorama, I did some work as well for an Australian local startup called Connections Australia. So they help migrants find work and settle into the country. And so that was the 2 years I sort of spent out in the wild in industry. 2016 and 2017, and 2018 was when I came back to UNSW.
Yeah, wow, fantastic. That sounds some really rewarding work there, especially helping migrants integrate into Australia. It's really good that you got a nice mix of big companies, startups, as well as some more work that's contributing to society. So for you kind of going into the industry, you had the benefit of the co-op placements to kind of give you a little bit of an insight into what might be out there and what you could do. So for first and second year students that are listening to this, they might not really know what the different paths are that they could go down at the end of their degree. Would you be able to give a little bit of tell us a little bit about what sort of things students typically do after they graduate?
It's incredible. There's just such a huge diversity. Uh, I was listening to the last podcast with Yanni, and she was kind of outlining a lot of these, and I would say that everything that she said is really useful as well. But I think there's even more. So if I look at sort of the friends that I had when I was in uni and where they are now, I mean, some of them are in America or the UK, working for companies like Google and so on. But of course, a lot of people enjoy just staying in Sydney, building a life here. And so the big banks, business analysis and project management, the kind of usual suspects are big ones, sure. But there are, I mean, this whole thing with design thinking and just digital marketing, digital stuff. That's also a really big increasing thing. And of course, the new rise of analytics. I guess there are certain degrees that you could study. So, for example, medicine, that's a degree that very clearly leads to a very defined outcome, because there's just so many precise, specific skills you need. Whereas I think information systems is kind of like an introduction to a very big world. And then from there, it's kind of a choose your own adventure. And so, yeah, I've seen that like people who study information systems can end up in things that you would imagine from like software engineering, and also vice versa. It's a very fluid world that we're living in these days.
I think what you covered was pretty like, there's so many different paths you can take as an information systems student, and that's why it's so amazing about the degree is that it's so flexible. And you talked about how some of your friends are in America or some of them in different industries. Do you think would be the best way to figure out what is personally right for a student?
It is definitely very challenging, and I can appreciate why you and a lot of listeners would be asking the very same question. I think certainly as you go through the actual study material, we as lecturers, our job, I think maybe you've heard of this before, is that we're not primarily teachers, but we're researchers, and a lot of the time, the stuff that we're teaching is incredibly like new and untested, and just like it's not very clear where the future is going to go. And I think you see a lot of that in like the new trends in INFS 1602. So just keeping an eye on those trends even after you've learned about it. I think, and perhaps it's to do with the way like exams work, particularly in like high school. But I think there's this common feeling that there's the world of study and the things that we study in the curriculum, and then there's the real world, and like there's somehow this magical barrier that separates the two. But I would say like tear down that barrier, because then you realize just how everything connects. And like if you learn about something in week 10 of INFS 1602 and it sounds interesting, even after the exam, it's still there. And it's still something that I definitely encourage people to look into. As part of that, I'd say like to be broadly, like I wouldn't say reading broadly, because these days a lot of the content is like audio or podcasts. But certainly there's these online websites that I read and I encourage people to read, like The Verge, Ars Technica, TechCrunch. Just like seeing what's happening today will give you a great advantage for deciding what to do tomorrow. There's podcasts like The Secret History of the Future This Week. So when you guys started this podcast, I was like, yes, podcasts, be more educated. And really sort of seeing where everything's going, you can find your place carved out into the future.
Sweet. Blair, I think that was great advice for students. I think reading widely and just finding and researching themselves to see what kind of things they're interested in through the courses they study, because I think that's how I found the path that I want to take. So I think that's definitely good advice to students. Read widely and try to get involved with the course content to see what things you like, things you don't like, and maybe start from there. I've done a little stalking. So I did a little LinkedIn stalking just to look at your previous experience as your students and when you're doing a cold placement, but also a graduate. And I could probably say that you're a very technical information systems grad. You've had some experiences in iOS development, web development, doing VBAs and SQL, and also worked as a software engineer, as you've specified. What are your thoughts about the stigma that information systems students can't be as technical and should not be seeking future roles in computer science or software engineering? What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a very tricky space in a way to navigate. It's complex. So there is certainly an extent to which I think I can see where that idea comes from, because all of us have studied some information systems courses and maybe some business courses, and so like that gives us a good overview of a lot of things. But one thing to keep in mind is that if someone was doing a bachelor of computer science, a bachelor of science in computer science, or bachelor of bachelor of engineering in software engineering, all the time that we would have spent doing things like accounting or management or learning about the Osterwalder business model canvas, I mean, like, yeah, sure, they may have missed out on that, but in the meantime, they were studying how to like optimize CPUs, as Yenny was doing in the last podcast, or like how to increase the speed of their sorting algorithm. And so I think there is an extent to which we should be humble and acknowledge that they definitely have a huge edge there. And that's speaking from my own experience, where trying to do everything will burn you out, and it's also to respect that other people have their own specialties. But I think where I would really challenge that perspective is to say that IS students can only do things like BA or PM, business analysis, project management, and that they shouldn't ever get involved in anything that's vaguely technical. There are certain technical things even, which I would say that our IS degree, just by nature of how much we cover them, is a huge advantage, just broadly speaking. We spend an absurd amount of time doing SQL. And I think that's really good because it gives us this huge edge in things like data. The thing with a lot of these engineering degrees is just because of the huge volume of technical information that they need to go through and they get really good at, they might get 2 weeks to learn everything in SQL, and they'll do it like drinking 3 cups of coffee and an energy drink, and they'll get through it. But it's certainly nowhere near the depth as much as like 2 whole courses or 3 or 4 just like bashing out SQL in various different forms. And so that's an example of something where, like, to see that everyone has a particular role. To give an analogy, like maybe some of the listeners watch MasterChef, right? There are certain contestants in MasterChef who are very good at making desserts, and there are some which are very good at making pasta. And then like they could get asked to swap and make each other's dish, and they could do it. But each of them has a background, they have a specialty, and everyone just does so much better if they play to their advantages. And I would say in all the teams that we're going to go into in future, in industry, in volunteering, to understand the whole team, everyone's different strengths, and play by that, that's what's going to make every one of those players go to full excellence.
So if a student is more interested in the technical side of things, and they do have that background in SQL and things like that, but they want to expand into other technical skills to make themselves a little more competitive out there if they want to go into a more technical area or just out of interest, what advice would you give them in terms of what's a good way to go about developing their technical skills while they're still studying INFS?
Yeah, certainly. So one of the funny things about, like, no matter which technical, or rather which computing tech degree you study, is that none of those degrees is primarily focused on imparting, let's say, coding skills or technical skills, but rather a way of thinking. So even in things like computer science or software engineering, a lot of the time, like, they won't actually be taught how to code per se, but they'll be taught how to teach themselves how to code. And it's a very similar thing that I think all our students, as they go through things like 1603, 1609, 2605, they find themselves having to go into the material. And sometimes it can be really frustrating that, like, why can't my tutor just make me good at this? But it's very much that this information is out there, and we just want to the old saying, you don't want to teach a person, you don't want to give a person a fish, you want to teach them how to go catch fish. And so the fish, I guess, once you're sort of looking at the new things that are happening, a lot of these resources are just online. If you just want to sort of pick it up, like, there's free YouTube tutorials and websites that have like great stuff about this. And there's even like these online courses like EDX and Coursera courses where you can even get like a little cute little certificate to say that you learned this. Like, I remember in my first year out, I was just interested in big data. And of course, nobody was teaching big data because it was really new. And like, Hadoop, like, nobody was teaching that. So I just found an online course, I think in Coursera, taught by like some university in America. And then I found out about Hadoop, and it's just so accessible. I think the bigger difficulty is to have the mindset of being able to approach these things. And I think as a lecturer in the School of Information Systems, my biggest wish for all the students isn't actually that they'll be really good at writing Java code or whatever. It's that they'll have that proficiency to go seek these things out on things like EDX or Coursera, or just like reading, or just having that energy to go do that. So one of the best ways to learn isn't a resource that I could offer, but just like have a look at your own life and like some need that you have to store information about something, and then like try to build it. So I remember I was in my industry placement, and as all interns do, I was taking a lot of meeting minutes, and I was like, wouldn't it be cool to have like a program where you could type meeting minutes and like it would print out what you wrote and what time you wrote it in, as you go through sort of the video of the thing. Anyway, yeah, so like I couldn't find a program that did that. And then I realized, like, that's not actually a difficult program to write. Like, you really just need INFS 1609 and a few spare hours, and you could write a program that does that. And so like trying to do something like that, but for your own life and whatever needs you have, you'll get so far just by pushing yourself to make something that's useful for you, and you enjoy it because you end up with something that's useful for yourself.
I think that's a great tip, Blair. At the end of the day, it's not really about what we learn within our courses, but like the mindset that we have and the willingness to actually push ourselves to learn certain things and think about, wait, analytics is like a big thing. Maybe I want to learn more about data, big data or something, and actually going in, having the mindset to actually proceed through it. I think it's definitely great advice for students that are out there. You talked about things like SQL, and I know within information systems that they study Java, and also using just reflecting back on your industry experience. Could you be able to just explain or talk about the main high-level programming languages that what they are, and also what the application are within an industry, or how they actually just apply in helping organizations?
Yeah, it's a funny one. So I for my final lecture of INFS 2605, I always sort of have the I think it's like the Stack Overflow programming survey, where they like list the top 10 programming languages, or just like coding languages. And so like a lot of them are things that we cover. Like Java is, as Yenny said last podcast, it's incredibly widespread, and it's very similar to things like C#, which is basically Java if Microsoft had made it. It's very absurdly similar. With mobile, like a lot of the native apps, you'd have to go with like either Google's preferred one, which I think is now Kotlin or Java, and with Apple's iPadOS stuff, which is Swift. But these are all like very closely related because they're all from the family of C, like the programming language C. So they all do the semicolon thing, they do the curly braces, and really it's just like minor syntax differences. So for anyone who's like actually, like if you're familiar with like European languages, you'll know that, for example, Spanish and Portuguese, French and Italian and English even are very similar to basically their grandfather, which is Latin. And it's the same idea here. These C-descended programming languages, that's another reason why we teach Java, because it's just like once you have access to Java, you can pick up any of the other C-based languages. The other big family are like sort of the scripting-based languages. So you can tell they're different because they don't have the semicolon. And the funniest thing is that when people like us try to learn them, we type in a semicolon because we're used to doing it, and then we get told that that's wrong. So things like Python, Bash, Ruby, I think, and even like PHP, for example, which is a web-based one, is closer to that family. I mean, there's heaps of things that I haven't covered. Like SQL is really a class of its own because it's specific for accessing databases. You've got things like JavaScript, which is like they try to go with multiple programming paradigms. So, for example, in JavaScript, the semicolon is optional, which is just really odd. It's I could talk about this for hours, but I don't know if that was sort of what you were going for.
No, definitely. It's just good to give students a wide different types of like what type of technical language there are. Because I started doing Python as well, and I just realized in Python you don't have to use semicolon at the end. And also used to in Java, like in 1609 and 2605 and also 3634, putting semicolons at the end. And I'm like, oh wait, you don't have to do that anymore. And it just kind of completely blew my mind. I guess in terms of just a follow-up question in terms of the programming languages, because there are so many, and we do have listeners that are not from an INFS background, so they might not have an experience in studying Java or SQL. Where do you think, let's say for like a business student that may not have any technical background, where do you think is the best way to start in terms of programming languages?
Yeah, that's really funny because I mean, a lot of the friends I had in like first year, because you start with like the commerce courses. So I've got friends who are accountants, and I remember them coming to me and saying, Blair, have you heard of this thing called Squill? What? Squill? It's SQL. Yeah, we have to learn this. And I'm like, why? And they were like, yeah, I'm an accountant, but I have to access the backend database to pull the financial records. And now everyone in my team has to learn Squill. And I'm like, perfect, please calling it Squill, attacking me. But also like, that's really cool. And I guess, yeah, so for business students who find themselves having to crunch a lot of data, I'm thinking things like accounting, for example. I'm seeing this among my friends that they're having to learn SQL. On the other hand, and so for example, one of my friends from high school who did in fact end up studying law, he ended up having to write Python code because there was a situation where I don't know the details of the project, but he had to like download a whole bunch of documents, legal documents from somewhere, and like he had to use Python to do it. And so he had to teach himself Python. And so like I was speaking to him and he was saying, oh, that was very intuitive because of the nature of the work that he was doing. So certainly to start off with, I mean, if you find yourselves in situations like that, I think life has already decided for you what programming language you're about. I think SQL is a huge advantage to start off with because there's a lot of things that you don't have to learn to be able to do SQL. Like a lot of the control structures, the if statements, the loops, that stuff that really stresses out students studying Java. That's not required for SQL. But on the other hand, you then have to understand like the difference between different types of data, like numerical versus text. Now, if you study statistics, that's actually like one of the things that you already understand anyway. So then that kind of statistical econometric stuff, it really lends itself to things like SQL. But just sort of to play around with programming, to understand the opposite end, where in Python, there isn't very much stress about data types, for example, that'd be good for them as well. I'd say like, I mean, I feel like I'm skirting around the question because I haven't actually given one or the other, but just to say like, they're both great. It's better than nothing, whichever one you choose.
I guess just what kind of websites or resources do you think are relevant or good for students to start tackling, I guess, for those that may not have the technical experience?
Yeah, so certainly there are those online courses that do have those coding things. If you are still in uni and you are sort of looking into information systems, shameless plug for, of course, the fact that we in the School of Information Systems do have courses in SQL and Java, and we are developing one right now, INFS 2822, which I'm really excited about because I'm sort of writing a lot of the material, pretty much all the material for not only Python, but also JavaScript and the shell terminal, bash terminal. So we do have those, but a lot of this material, again, you can get it online. It's hard for me to say one definitive, like that website is the best because everyone seems to have their own favorite one. I mean, like, I think probably the easiest point is just to go into your favorite search engine, type how to learn some programming language, and you'll see some resource or something that then if you have enough energy to go and figure it out for yourself, it's gonna be there.
Yeah, that's some good advice. There's so many resources online. I personally love using LinkedIn Learning, though I haven't really used that for super technical stuff, more just theoretical things when you're looking at, like, if you're just interested in Google Cloud Platform or Microsoft Azure and just understanding what they're like. There's lots of good resources out there. Just to totally change topic now, you're back at UNSW as a student, as a PhD candidate in information systems. So what caused that change of track to come back and become an academic?
Yeah, so I think I at the start of this episode I mentioned how like childhood Blair was really interested in tech, and that's a very specific thing, but also just broadly things like society and economics and the world. And that is still a bit of an exotic combination. And so I remember I was out first year out in the industry, but also because I did an honors degree, which is required as part of the co-op program, I did do some research. And that actually I was really fortunate that actually got published. So in academia, when you do some work and you send it out to conferences, to journals, you can be accepted into them, and then you can go to wherever the conference is held and present your work. So it was in Taiwan. And I remember I'd never been to Taiwan. I thought it was kind of cool to travel. And I went there and presented my undergraduate honors research project about crowdfunding. But while I was there, my honors supervisor, Eric Lim, who some of you might know from some of your courses, Dr. Lim took me to dinner with some of his friends, and I was connecting with all these academics from different parts of the world, like Denmark and Singapore, and just learning about their life. And I was hearing what they were doing, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is like exactly like I love all this stuff about like society and like big theories about where we're going, and that stuff I was saying about knowledge work. I love that stuff. I do like the technical stuff as well. And so around the same time, one of my lecturers from when I was a student, who's no longer at UNSW, but he had collected our email addresses from some other project, that like some volunteering thing. And he was like, I just got some government funding to research this topic, and I'm looking for a PhD candidate. And I know you folks are hardworking. Would any of you like to do this project? And it was like a group email. And I don't think anyone else actually was that interested, because they were all really happy with whatever path they were on. But I was thinking, yeah, research, which I know feels like a really nerdy and unusual thing to say. But I ended up applying for that, and I was really lucky to then actually get in and start this journey in 2018. So the thing with the PhD is that there are definitely fields. I mean, some of you might have friends who are studying things like psychology, or I don't know, like sociology or something, where in order to really fulfill what you want to do with that degree, you have to pretty much get a PhD. Like a lot of the practicing psychologists they have to have a PhD to be where they are. It's a little bit different in things like business or tech. I don't think there's any expectation that like you have to have a PhD to rise up the ranks in industry. It's more so that I was really interested in a lot of this teaching stuff and society and tech in society. And so the teaching stuff is really sort of how I maintain a connection with the technical side, because a lot of the work we do in research isn't at all about programming. It's about like reading social theory and like reading about like that whole Japanese management philosophy thing. So, but I wanted to maintain that connection with coding. That was something I really enjoyed. And so I'm really fortunate that when I came back, speaking to one of my PhD supervisors, Dr. Michael Kahalan, I think some of you will know of him from your capstone course. He was kind of saying, well, it's not unusual for us to get our PhD candidates to start with tutoring and maybe even doing some lecturing work in their later years. Would you be interested? And I just jumped at the opportunity, because I just love maintaining that connection with that really deeply technical aspect, even if it's not really related to the rest of my work. It's just so great to see that, and I'm really pleased to be back.
Yeah, wow, that's huge that you got published. That's amazing. Great opportunity there to go to Taiwan. How would you describe your experience of research so far? Because I mean, many students, I think I'd say a lot of students in INFS probably won't end up doing honours or PhD. Maybe that's changing now. More people will come back and do that. But what has been your experience so far in doing a PhD, and what are some skills that you were able to pick up that's different from what you've experienced elsewhere?
Yeah, it's really funny because like my undergraduate was very similar to a lot of what the audience would have, would be doing, which is a Bachelor of Information Systems to some extent. But a lot of what I've been doing now, like I speak to some of my younger friends who are like maybe studying arts, like sociology arts, or studying like management, and like it's much more similar to what I'm reading, because I guess as with that level of work, that's sort of more the direction that we're going to. That when it gets to that level, information systems is really closely related with those other disciplines as well. I'd say that research is a really great opportunity to really fully, really deeply understand a lot of the ideas, and how ideas are born. So I don't know if this is still part of INFS 1602, but I remember learning about the Osterwalder business model canvas. And at the time, I was just took it for granted. Like, this is clearly how the world works because textbook said so, and textbook is right. And then, like, I only discovered when I was a PhD student that entire business model canvas and like all the things that are in it, that was Alexander Osterwalder's PhD thesis. Like that, someone like that. There was a period in time when that entire thing just did not exist, and people could not get the insight that the Osterwalder business model canvas gives you. And then someone decided to spend 3 years at a university doing research, and now, boom, we have the Osterwalder business model canvas. He was very clever. He named it after himself. But you can see where, like, now so many people get to benefit from having that, and it's spread to all sorts of different lines of work. And the fact of the matter is, and this really blew my mind, every single idea that you've ever learned in any course, that originated with some grad student like myself, having to, or some honor student like yourselves, maybe like in their undergraduate degree, sitting there having to think about the world and looking into how the world works, and then creating something that's gonna have a lasting impact with like all these people around the world that they've never met. I think if anyone is listening to this and you have the opportunity to do honors as part of your undergrad degree, or if you might even consider like even higher levels of research in postgrad, it's a wonderful opportunity. If you're able to have that, it's a huge privilege to be involved in that. It is very difficult. It does require your brain to feel like it's overheating all the time. But just the things that you see there, it's a very unique experience.
I think what you described was definitely what my friend said about honors and what they think were like the benefits of doing honors, because you're able to make that impact that could have unlimited reach. You could have someone that's reading in, I don't know, some in the US or like Mexico or something like that, reading your paper, and they might be impacted about it. And I think that's why research is so powerful in that regards, because you don't know the amount of impact you could actually make. And it's interesting that you brought that up. I think moving on, just away from your PhD experience and your honors experience, but more about the courses that you teach. For those that are studying information systems, maybe familiar with Blair because he is the lecturer for 2605. So could you just give us an overview of what 2605 is for those they'll be studying in the next couple of years, or are unfamiliar with information systems as generally?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the groundwork has thankfully been laid by Yenny in the previous podcast, because she described INFS 1609, which is sort of the first Java course where you learn the very basic building blocks of programming, just like how to think like a programmer, I think is how she put it. So you can see from the course code, INFS 2605 is just the next course after that. And so we basically expect that everyone's gone through that. And then we say, that's great. You can do all this programming stuff. But we really want you to have fun now. We want you to build something that's a lot closer to the programs that you use on a daily basis, or apps that you use on a daily basis. So what you don't have in 1609, because you're still just learning the fundamentals, is you don't have any connection to databases, and you don't have any graphical user interfaces. So like what you see on the screen with the boxes and mouses clicking on things and things like that, because it's quite hard to do that as a first year student. So once you've got the logic and the mindset from 1609, we really push you to connect to SQL databases from within Java. So that's like having to juggle two programming languages at the same time in one file, having to design like these little nice graphical user interface layouts, and thinking about like user experience and design as well. So it's a very different flavor, I would say, to 1609, but I love this course. It was my favorite course as a student. It was also the one I had the highest mark on, just because it's just so satisfying seeing something come to life. I mean, I think it's great that in a lot of the introduction programming courses, you like print hello world to the terminal, which is in and of itself an achievement. But to then come out of this course, and I've seen some work that my students have made, and it is just, it is amazing. Like the kinds of designs and features that you can build when they really put their mind to it.
Yeah, no, there is definitely that great sense of achievement that you get in INFS 2605 when you have an outcome that looks a lot closer to things you see in the real world. I can definitely relate to that feeling when you get like an animation working or some networking aspect happening. It is kind of rewarding. So you mentioned that you did quite well in INS 2605, but often students quite find that a very challenging subject, particularly those that maybe aren't so technical. What are some tips that I guess you give your students now that you have to do well in 2605 and all their other coding courses?
Yeah, absolutely. And to really be transparent, I did also struggle a lot in 2605. And I look back at a lot of the work that I was doing, and I was like, oh wow, that's quite a funny mistake that I made. And I'm sure many students have the same experience. So I agree with a lot of what Yenny said in the previous podcast about like rote learning these kinds of things just isn't going to work. It's not built for that kind of thing. It's really hands-on, and give it a shot and learn by doing. But sort of to take a step back, and I know that I've seen students be very upset because they feel like they're not doing well. And one thing that I do say from time to time, and it almost seems obvious, but like you're learning, you're taking this course, you're learning it because you're not good at it. Like if you are good at this, you shouldn't be here. You should be working. Why are you studying this if you're good at it? Everyone who's studying anything is by definition not going to be good at it, and that's okay. And go easy on yourself. It's absolutely okay that like, of course it's going to crash. It's very normal that it crashes, and for experienced programmers of decades of experience, their programs will crash too. And please don't be so hard on yourself. I think UNSW students are exceptionally hard on themselves, that they just expect themselves to be good straight away, and if it's not, then they're somehow a failure. And it's okay, it's all right. But once sort of that aspect is out of the way, like the very strategic things about how to become good at this, is just to sort of take a step back. I think that the thing that really gets students stuck in the mud is like the program doesn't work, so they just stare at their code and sort of expect that some epiphany will arise. And I can see where that comes from, because things like essay writing and thinking about like social business topics, yeah, that works. Like you stare at the Osterwalder business model canvas, and eventually you might actually come up with something. But just I've had students email me saying, I've looked at this problem for 10 hours staring at the screen, and the answer is not coming to me. And I'm thinking, no, it wouldn't. Really, you're just going to give yourself eye strain. Take a step back, like go to a whiteboard, draw out the problem, talk about the problem with a friend. It's great that you have each other. There's this programming problem-solving technique called the rubber duck technique, where like experienced programmers will buy a rubber duck and talk to the rubber duck to explain the problem. And then that's how they arrive at the solution, right? So it's very different to a lot of these business courses, but that's sort of a few tips that I've picked up along the way.
Those are definitely great tips for students. I guess hopefully students are also listening again to listen and how to actually succeed in coding courses, because that's probably one of the biggest questions I get from younger students. Like, how did you get past the coding courses? And I think Blair just mentioned some of the top tips. I think you guys should listen in and just don't stress overall. I think at the end of the day, you guys should be fine. I know that you wanted to make a quick announcement about a new information system course that's being introduced and like an elective under the Bachelor of Information Systems. I think the course is going to be called INFS 2822. Could you give us like a little brief and quick pitch on what the course is going to be on?
Yeah, so INFS 2822 is called Programming for Data Analytics. So as far as the university sees it, it's a course to teach you how to use programming techniques to crunch data. And so that's exceptionally different to all our other programming courses like Java related, because like we've been talking about INFS 1609, 2605, that's to build software. But increasingly, the need is to just write a quick, it's not even a program, it's a script. It's a quick bit of code that will crunch data in unimaginable, amazing ways. And so that's basically what this course is about. Some people have been referring to it as the Python course, and I can see where that comes from, because a lot of the best tools that you have in terms of programming to crunch through big sets of data, complex, messy sets of data, is to use Python. And I'm really excited that this is the first time that we've taught Python in the school. And that's definitely great. But there's a lot of other things in the course that I really am looking forward to just students playing with, like, for example, Bash shell scripting in the terminal. In some ways, as I've been writing out the material for this course, I've been thinking, like, this is everything I wish that I could have learned. Because I think, like, there are so many of these random little things that we just haven't had as part of our IS curriculum. And I think we really want to progress in that direction. And one of the things, for example, that I want to do with this course is to show students learn how to use the terminal. Like, I know it looks scary because it's this big black box with white writing and it looks like something out of the Matrix. But like, if you just have this one skill, which takes not that much time to learn, you're going to just be so proficient at like everything to do with computers and everything to do with crunching data. So it's going to be this huge opportunity to learn all these little things that are just going to be so useful for you in whatever jobs you're going, whether it's data analytics focused jobs or just like anything where you need to operate a computer in any capacity. The only prerequisite for this is INFS 1603 or the equivalent. I think this course is also being offered as part of an analytics degree where they study 1603 but with a different course code. So basically that's all we expect, that students go into the course knowing 1603, and we don't really go into the SQL side. We just want students to generally understand the idea of data and data types and data modeling going into 2822. So it's going to be offered for the first time in term 3. I'm really excited to be lecturing that in term 3. And for anyone who's completed 1603 or equivalent, I'd love to encourage you to go and enroll in that, and we'll have a great time together.
I think there's going to be a lot of interest in that course. I know myself personally, I really was interested in learning Python. I did it instead as a computing for engineers gen ed course, but that's more from the engineering perspective. So I think it's really great that we're going to have a IMS course that looks at it more from the data perspective and utilizes our previous experience in SQL. So could you just give a little bit more of an insight into the difficulty of the course, and will students struggle if they don't think they're very good at coding? Maybe some words of encouragement for students that might shy away from an elective like that, but would be beneficial. What are the benefits for them for taking that on?
Yeah, so we don't require any background in coding as such. So if you've never touched programming, like loops and statements and things like that, we don't expect any of that. In fact, the actual introduction to Python part, the equivalent of the textbook that we're using, is one that's designed for people who have no background at all in any kind of coding. The 1603 requirement is really just to understand the data aspect. It certainly is not going to be just a breeze in the park. It is going to challenge you, but in a good way. You're going to have to struggle, but in a good way, so that you come out of it much stronger and having learned all that stuff. It is a UNSW course. We're going to have tutors. We're going to have support for everyone. And because it's sort of all designed from the ground up, it's designed sort of during the COVID-19 era. So we know that it's going to have built into it a lot of the assumptions about the fact that, for example, it's going to be online teaching. We're going to use the ed forums, for example. So support built for the COVID-19 lockdown era.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I'm so actually jealous of students that actually get to take this course. I can't unfortunately take it anymore. I'm a bit too old and basically just finished my information system course. Because I think Terminal and Python in general are very, good tools to learn. I always see people within work, like software engineers, use Terminal, and it's just so cool. And I wish I could learn it myself. And I'm so mad that I can't take it, unfortunately. But like Blair said, it would be an amazing opportunity for students that are interested in Python or want to learn a deep dive into technical. I suggest you take it. I think it will be a great skill to learn. And like Rachel said, get that data aspect of it. So it'll be interesting. Just to wrap up, finally, so Blair, do you have any general tips or some main tips for students to actually help them succeed through work, studies, whatever there is in general in life?
So I've got 3 things. The first is sort of, as we're in university right now, and most of the audience, I assume, are undergraduate students at some level, is to understand what university is and why you're here. I think because a lot of us, as we're in undergraduate, we're coming sort of fresh out of high school, we still carry, to some extent, that high school mentality of sort of, we have teachers and they're here to make us really good really quickly at this one exam thing, and if I'm not, as I was saying before, this culture at UNSW where if I'm not good at it straight away, then I must be awful. Universities are research institutions that are designed to challenge ourselves. Everyone who's here is doing something that they're not good at in order to become good at it, or they're developing something that we as humanity are not good at so that we're good at it, whether it's a cure for coronavirus or if it's how to code better. So it's definitely okay. One of the things we talked about earlier was like being worried about struggling. I'd say like we as university students or people in a university, we're professional strugglers. Like we've chosen to allocate huge tracts of our time, of our years, of our youth to struggle through things. And through that struggle, we become so much stronger. And to remember that we're not here to already have been good at it, because you really probably have better things to do if you're already perfect at everything you're doing here. The second thing is to not compare yourself with others, but to think about what you want to be. I think this is another sort of observation about our culture, is that we often have this idea that there's just one scale from like best to worst, and that you are somewhere on that scale and you're either the alpha or you're not. That's not really just how society works anymore, or has worked for the past several centuries. Instead, we talk about unique value proposition and points of differentiation. Every person that I went to university with, at the time, I think we were very keen on seeing like, oh, but my friend's already 1 week ahead, and their WAM is so and so, but my WAM is so and so. I mean, like, we're all going to have very different journeys coming out of this. And it's not about like quantitatively where we are on the scale, but like qualitatively, what unique story are we going to be able to tell in 10 years, 20 years? If one of the listeners was listening to this and thinking like one day they might be interviewed on the BITSA podcast 2030, story isn't going to be what was your WAM at the end of second year. It's going to be what journeys you had. And my third sort of advice is to sort of take a step back and find the time to breathe. I think sometimes, especially those of us who are co-op scholars or cadets or something where we have overcommitted a bit and we have a lot of commitments and we're really close to burning out. In this journey as knowledge workers, the most precious asset we're going to have is our mind. And so if we overwork it, then it will suffer, and we've just damaged our most precious asset. You know, from an accounting perspective, it's not a good idea to damage your most precious asset. So just look after yourselves, especially during these difficult times. We're, as Yenny said last week, and as we're all hearing over and over again, we're all in this together. We're going to get through this, and everything's going to be okay.
That's so encouraging. I think always students are comparing themselves. They're like, oh, but this guy got an HCWAM, but I don't have an HCWAM. And I think that culture is really embedded with us. And I think at the end of the day, the students shouldn't be focusing on their mark, but actually think about where they're at, what their overall goal is, and what they really want to achieve. And I think having that rest as well is good. Just having that balance of obviously working hard, but having some rest, enjoying their life, enjoying their social element, things like that, things that they want to enjoy. And I think those are definitely great 3 tips for students to take away from this episode as well. So I think just to finalize, I just really want to thank Blair for being on the podcast and taking the time out of his busy PhD schedule. So thanks so much, Blair, for coming on and giving us some great tips around everything in general. So thanks so much, Blair.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I wish everyone all the best, and thanks for having me here today.
Thanks, Blair.
Coming on. Just to wrap up, guys, thanks again for tuning in to the second episode BITSA podcast. You can find this on the YouTube channel UNSW BITSA, and just follow us on Instagram and Facebook at UNSW BITSA. Other than that, I'm going to signal out. See you guys. Thanks so much for coming on and joining on our second podcast. Thanks, guys.
See you guys.